In fiction, a plot is the sequence of connected events that make up a narrative. I say connected in that these events are not random things that arbitrarily happen. There's a relationship between them, usually a causative one. A happens, so B happens, so C happens, and as a result, D happens, etc. Generally, a plot in fiction leads up to a climax that answers a central question or resolves a central conflict. Unless you're writing really experimental fiction, your story has a plot in it. Narrative works have a plot. If you want to be a fiction writer, it is a good idea to understand how to structure a good, engaging, well paced plot. However, many writers overemphasize the importance of plot. They focus on plot so much that they forget about everything else. In this episode of Rite Good, we are joined once again by Karlo Yeager Rodríguez, who is going to tell us why plot isn't everything. Thank you for joining us for the very first time to record. We definitely did not have technical difficulties before. This is the super uniquely our first recording session on this particular topic.
This is, in fact, the first time we are recording this episode. I have been instructed to tell you this by our Right Good Legal. Oh, wait, I wasn't supposed to read that last part. Sorry.
Yeah.
Welcome. Yeah, thanks for having me back. I was going to welcome myself back. That's how off the cuff this is going to be. But yeah, like, thanks for having me back. Let's talk about vibes. And I just want to get this off my chest. Fuck Freytag's pyramid. Yeah, fuck
Yeah.
that guy. And saving the cat. Let the cat figure it out.
Yeah, let the cat save himself.
That's liberation cat theory.
Yeah. When you save a cat, you save him for a day. But when you teach a cat to save himself, you save him for a lifetime.
At least 9 lifetimes, from what I
Yeah.
understand.
God saves cats who save themselves.
There you have it.
Yeah.
The Bible is vibes only.
The Bible is a lot of vibes. There's a lot of vibes. So let's start by talking a little bit about the problem with a plot centered approach to writing. And we want to say off the bat that it is good to understand plot. It's fine. When you're a newbie writer, especially, you're probably meandering a lot. You're having trouble cutting stuff that needs to be cut. So you end up getting a lot of advice, which for you at that stage is very solid. Like, hey, this doesn't serve the plot. Maybe you need to cut this. But like that Strunk and White advice about omitting needless words, never using adjectives, shunning the passive voice, people take it way too far and they forget about things like character or mood or setting or theme and so on. And we end up with this emaciated work of literature. You start becoming ruthless about cutting everything that doesn't serve this central capital P plot.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things and one of the mistakes that when you're starting, and perhaps as you continue, right, you have to sort of get to a point where you understand what you want to say whenever you sit down to write or create art or what have you. And one of the problems is that you take these, like the Strunken White one is very funny because if you wanted to take that to its absurd, logical conclusion, he's like, well, don't write needless words. None of these words are needed. Like art is not necessary, so I will turn in a blank page. This is my plot. These are my vibes right here. But no, these are all tools to be used or put aside as is needed. And I think part of what I think you're driving at is that you have to learn to a certain extent what the rules are before you start really deviating from them and figuring out ways where you can deviate from them
Right.
and inject those plots or those vibes into that plot so that it feels a little bit more fleshed out or the world feels more real.
Right. Right. It's kind of like you got to learn how to walk before you learn how to dance. Walk, you put one foot in front of the other, but after a while, one foot in front of the other doesn't work as advice when you're learning how to dance.
Yeah,
It's not one foot in front of the other every single time. It's foot goes to the side or behind or you kick it or something.
yeah. I mean, once you've moved on to dancing 201 salsa, yeah, that's one foot in front of the other is fine. Elements to build upon to get to salsa or whatever the other dance is exactly.
Right. Right. And we want to stress too that there are certain genres, there are certain modes of writing that are very plot centered and centered on a very particular type of plot and a very particular plot structure. Airport thrillers are very, very plot driven. The vibes aren't super important. It just tends to be okay. We need a fast paced plot with twists at this part, this part, this part, this part, this part. Here's the main plot. Here's the subplot, and the twist goes there. And if you actually look at the way these thrillers are structured, there's a very specific page range in which here's the subplot twist, and now the main plot's twist is going to happen on page 67, and they've really got it down specifically. And that's okay for that mode of writing, but there are other ways to tell a story.
Yeah. It's weird because especially like those what we call airport thrillers or beach reads, all are you're saying they're very formulaic. They do actually follow like a very specific type of formula, and it's only the deviations from that formula that make those stand out. I mean,
Yeah.
look at look at how awful a writer Dan Brown is and how much that motherfucker sold. This is the final boss of all of our conversation, I feel. It's the profit motive in capitalism, but we can save
Right.
that for a little bit.
Right. And if you are churning things out just to sell, then like this advice probably won't be for you. But I think the problem is that people get stuck into this mode of here's how you're supposed to write a story because this is a story that's very lucrative. But
Mhm.
it might not be your goal to move a certain number of units. And we often end up confusing, well, here's a good way to write a marketable book versus here's a book that's going to be really, really good, maybe not necessarily as profitable.
Yeah. Part of the I feel like if we can talk a little bit about how plot can be it can end up feeling like your characters are doing things for contrived reasons.
Yeah, yeah, your characters start becoming like objects dragged around by events,
Mhm.
almost like, well, this has to happen, so this is your character's got to go there. Like, oh, okay.
I mean, yeah, again, I'm gonna I'm gonna invoke Dan Brown. It honestly feels, and that is part of that thriller idea that you have to have the cat and mouse game is required, but then like to a certain extent, if the cat and mouse game is incinerating papal candidates in Rome or blowing up buildings, it sort of feels like wait, hold on, couldn't they have just when you get to the end and you figure out that it was somebody that was very close to everyone, you're like, well, couldn't they have figured that out a little earlier, given the degree of problems and like mayhem that this person caused? Anyway, maybe that's
Yeah.
me. D- that maybe that's just me, but I do know that there are people that sort of accept it and shrug and keep reading. It's fine.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, these are books that are they're called airport reads for a reason because that's what your brain wants when you're on an airplane. You don't necessarily want a work that's particularly deep or challenging. You want something that's kind of fun to pass the time because you're sitting in coach and your feet hurt and your knees hurt. And that's fine for that. But my problem is people take that and forget that there's other ways to write. And that's my problem where this one approach, this very commercially viable approach, like swallows or pushes out every other approach, and that's what I find upsetting.
Yeah, I mean, to really talk about how that breakneck pace just becomes it becomes very wearying as a reader, right? After a while, I like you, if it's just wall to wall action all the time, you're like, well, hold on. So how is anyone gonna sit back and try to plan anything?
Mhm,
Because the funny thing is that you start noticing that when you have become a little bit weary of the breakneck pace of something. I've
mhm,
had that happen. Like I've had that happen where I'm like, this is sufficiently well written, but it's been like 7 chapters and it's just been action, action, action. Nothing stops. It's just like one hook after another. And I'm exhausted just reading this.
right,
And I put it down and sometimes I never come back because it's sort of like a weird imbalance. There's
mhm.
no time to breathe.
There's none of that negative space, none of that "ma."
Mhm. Yeah, and if we can circle back to I really love I'm sure it's not Miyazaki Hayao Miyazaki did not come up with this. I think it's part of the tradition, of storytelling in Japan, but I know that he was the one that introduced me to that concept, and suddenly you have a name for something that, honestly, if we can stray into sort of like anime and audiovisual shows and series and whatnot, there's a lot of stuff that if it's not like something like Naruto or Dragon Ball Z, no shade to those. That's they got their audiences, but it's not like 15 episodes of the same fight or whatever. Generally speaking, those other ones generally have some moments, these quiet moments where it's a scene of the countryside to sort of almost as an establishing shot, but it's held just a moment longer than it should.
Yeah, it's like
Um,
breathing room or something. You just get a moment to
exactly.
catch your breath. Here's a
Yeah.
here's a shot of some wind running through the grass.
Yeah,
There it is.
exactly. I remember pointing out on a very viral tweet that I had about the scene in Spirited Away where she's on the train and she's still, she's not really talking, there's nothing happening. She's in literal movement as well as sort of like you assume sort of mental movement. You can tell that from the way she's drawn and postured and all that stuff that she's thinking about things. And oddly, it's also a moment in the movie where everything slows down and you as a viewer, as part of the audience, can also mull over exactly what's happened up until that
Right.
point.
It's this really important time to decompress too, because she's switching modes. She's switching from this bathhouse to this witch's hut out in the forest. She's just we're changing the rhythm of this story. We're changing the pace, setting, mood, and it's like,
she
okay, let's take a moment to change,
she got a
change
side quest.
gears. Yeah.
She got a little side quest.
Yeah,
And
this is the
but
loading screen or
yeah, yeah.
something.
Well, I mean, and that's funny because I keep on wondering if it's a combination of too many people watching movies and shows, and also this idea like the JRPGs or even just regular computer RPGs of some sort where you have fast travel. And so all those, like, you walking around is not something that happens unless you're a specific type of game. You can just go to the map screen. Okay, I'm gonna go to this dot. Okay, bye. And you show up at the new place rather than travel there.
Yeah, I can kinda see that a little bit. And I think part of it too is just we're going from movies and we're kinda going from trash movies that are really, really based on, like, just propel everything forward. We're going based on a very narrow idea of plot that again, that fucking save the cat style 3 act structure.
Mhm.
This is our only understanding of plot, and we try to cram every kind of story into it, and that's not every story needs to be that.
I invoked Freytag's pyramid, which has the, what is it? The rise, climax, and fall. And even there, that feels like it's the 3 act structure in and of itself. Generally speaking, there are 2 points at the ends, right? Before
Mhm.
the beginning is the introduction. So there is some time to establish whatever it is. And then the end is catastrophe. And you're like, oh, that's interesting. Like, I don't know that it's supposed to mean that it ends badly, but definitely
Right.
something happens at the end that is not expected or not intended.
Yeah.
Uh, it feels like the those types of endings of horror movies where suddenly at the last moment the hand of the slasher shows up on screen to grab the axe
Right.
again.
Right. Yeah. But this hyper focus on plot and a very narrow understanding of plot, it almost becomes tyrannous in a way, like, we have to cut everything that doesn't serve the plot, because then we start ending up with really bad discourse, like, a lot of bad sex scene discourse is like,
Mm.
"Well, does that sex scene advance the plot?" No, maybe it probably doesn't, but it's revealing a lot about the characters and their relationships with each other. N no, it's not essential to the plot, but it's a part of people's lives.
Yeah, just like showing people eating or cooking or anything that people like to do. I mean, it's do you have to show them walking to the place? No, no, not really, but
Yeah,
maybe.
and again, it's so funny that people will talk about, We got to cut this sex scene. It doesn't serve the plot." But then they'll be the ones who show the montage of like, "Oh, I love how food looks in Miyazaki movies." Like, well, it's not serving the plot to show someone cooking eggs, but it's nice. It's nice. I like watching it.
I mean, I think that it's very simply that everyone likes to eat, but sex might be icky or makes you feel icky or makes you feel horny, which gets you into Twitter jail or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah.
It I I don't I'm not trying to figure out these people's mindsets in that sense because honestly, the people that don't get it, if you're trying to write any type of slower scene, a quiet scene,
Mhm.
vibes scene, if you will,
Yeah.
are not really these are not the audience for you, right? They want you
Nope.
to move on to the next thing.
Yeah, I've definitely gotten negative feedback like, "This scene is filler." No, it isn't. It's just a moment to breathe. Anything that doesn't rocket you forward is filler, and that's not true. That
Well, I
is
mean,
not
yeah,
true.
I think that that's sort of like if you are just always on the scroll of
Mhm.
whatever social media, you're being stimulated all the time. So I don't know. It's very strange. I'm not trying to attribute any of this to any one thing. I think it's just
It's
it's
a
sort of like a
mess of
weird
things coming together.
yeah, it's like a whole environment that's been created. And the thing that we can definitely point to that does affect weirdly backwards towards novel writing and even short story writing is the Save the Cat structure, which follows that same three-act structure. And honestly, like one of the very few things that I was surprised by is the amount of different types of dramatic structures that non-Western, even Western, like
Even Western in ye olden days.
well, yeah, like Romans like to have a one or two act structure. I think Socrates favored the two-act structure. There was three-act structure, sure, but Shakespeare was working with five, where everyone, the fifth act was everyone got married or there was a giant feast or perhaps both at the same time. Who knows? And granted, I think that part of the issue is that it's a weird feedback loop. I feel that the audiences have been trained to only respond well to a three-act structure,
Yeah.
which then reinforces the people that hold the purse strings for movies and all sorts of media to then only rely upon three-act structure. But there is one caveat, and this is something really important. We love to talk about Miyazaki, but he's been at it for a while and he's earned the audience's trust as well as the
Yeah.
trust of the people that sort of finance his movies, right?
Yeah, no one's
They
gonna
tr-
tell him you can't show someone eating ramen. To be
yeah,
like,
exactly.
"Fuck you. I'm
Like
Miyazaki, I can show people eating ramen."
yeah, like any one of the advice things that you see in writing, if Stephen King breaks any one of those quote rules, it doesn't matter. He's fucking Stephen King. He
Yeah.
can do it because he's been a long enough. He's been in there long enough and has made publishing enough money that they don't care. He could write his laundry list at the beginning and it would not break any rules.
Right. It is interesting though, because I have seen people who get so plot-brained that it does color the way that they approach other narratives that have, I guess, earned the right to deviate. Like, there was that one YA author who complained that Tolkien named weapons in his stories. Like, why call the sword Sting if it's not essential to the plot? Well, it gives you a sense of mood, it suggests this wider world outside the major events of this particular story. I don't know exactly why that sword was named Sting. All I know is that someone named it, so that sword has been through some shit, and that the fact that people know its name means that it's a really special sword.
Yeah, it's funny because that in and of itself shows character. Because Sting was named by Bilbo. Let me put on my The Hobbit nerd hat
Okay.
a minute. So one of the things that is really interesting about that is it misunderstands what Tolkien was trying to do here, right? If I remember correctly, they weren't talking about Sting specifically, but let's use Sting as an example because they find it in the cache of old treasure and there's like a sword that Gandalf recognized. Oh, that's Glamdring, which in Elvish means foe hammer. And he sort of tells a small line of it was in the battle of such and such city, which denotes this deep, deep time that exists in Tolkien's world. And Bilbo finds a little dagger that for him is like a short sword, as you know, as big as a short sword. And he's like, Bilbo being a hobbit and very sort of simple country folk type of archetype almost, he's like, well, I'll call it Sting. It not pretentious. It's just it reminded him of a bug's sting, and that's what he was going to call it.
Right.
And it shows character. It just shows that Bilbo isn't aware fully of that deep time and history and blah blah blah. He's like, yeah, I'm just gonna call this one Sting.
Yeah. Plus, I think it's worth noting that there are weapons in legend that do have names, like the Excalibur.
Excalibur was just a guy that Arthur knew. No, no, no. Excalibur's a perfect example. There's all sorts of named weapons
The
in myth and
Masamune.
legend.
And
Yeah.
all I know about that is that in a JRPG, when you get a sword called the Masamune, you're like, "Oh shit, this is really big. This is a big deal."
Well, I mean, yeah, it's isn't that he's like the master sword fighter.
Yeah, he was the
One
legendary sword maker or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, like it's supposed to evoke, in this case, a different culture and the history behind that. I mean, it's sort of like a weird a weird nitpick to pull out of Tolkien, like, "Oh, he names a sword. How boring."
It
Like,
doesn't serve the plot. Plus,
it's
I think it's a lot easier. It's a lot more interesting to read, And then he unsheathed Sting versus, and then he unsheathed his sword.
mm,
Ah.
mhm, mhm.
Especially when there's a
Yeah.
lot of dudes with swords, you want to distinguish between different swords.
Well, and sometimes some of those swords are extra special,
Yeah, special
like
sword. That's cool.
if you're a Roman legionnaire, your little short sword that you were given doesn't have a name because it's mass produced. But if you found a relic, it better have a name. Come on, man.
Yeah, or if you're some fancy person who could hire the greatest blacksmith in all the land to make you this very special sword that's weighted and structured exactly for your arm, for your hand, then it's like, oh, you're hot shit. You're a big deal.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, even in we're reading over at Podside, we're reading the Book of the New Sun, and the sword in that one is called Terminus Est, which is the dividing line or here the point of division, I believe it could be
Ooh.
interpreted as. And so it's funny because it's a name, sure, it's a named sword, but it also sort of really plays with the name of the swords points to a bunch of different other instances where it becomes this weird theme where there is a lot of weird doublings and mirrorings in the story that make you wonder.
Something I've also seen more recently, and this is for a movie and not a book, so
Mhm,
I'm committing a sin by talking about a movie, is the movie Nope. I've seen
mhm,
people complain that the Gordy subplot doesn't directly relate to the central plot of Nope. It doesn't cause the monster exactly, but I mean, it develops Jupe's backstory so beautifully. It fits perfectly with the overall themes about how the entertainment industry expects people to package and sell their trauma, about how there are certain things that really should not be tamed. It fits the way marginalized people working in the industry or child actors are abused like animals or even worse than animals. And that scene, the thing that happens to Jupe would not be as, like, brutal and heart-rendering if you didn't have the Gordy subplot.
mhm.
It
Yeah.
would not work as well as it does without the Gordy subplot.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the other things that that is suffusing that film is the idea that I said this before that human beings treat animals like objects,
Right.
which is weird when you start thinking about like Gordy the chimp or even the horses at Haywood Hollywood horses. Yes, these are just simply non-human intelligences, just
Yeah.
as the plot driver in this codename Jean Jacket is as well, right? It's a non-human intelligence, just like any one of the other animals. Uh,
Right.
it's just so weird. I've also heard about like
Like, imagine them trying to cut that from the movie, it would just suck.
Mhm.
It would be
Well, I mean,
terrible. You'd miss so much.
even more granular, I've heard, "Why was the shoe standing on it?" Who cares?
Yeah.
I mean, sure, it's I mean, it's there for a reason.
Would it turn out, "Oh, yeah, the alien caused the shoe to stand up." Like, "What?
Well, I
No,
mean,
come on."
maybe
No.
I don't know, but
No.
I wasn't thinking about that. I just think, honestly, that is a vibes only shot,
And
right?
it does strike me as, like, during really weird, bad, traumatic moments, sometimes you'll notice one kind of weird, out of place thing and focus
Mhm.
on it. Like, "Oh, that guy's socks are 2 different colors." And
Well, I
it's
mean,
not like it's just incidental, it's not anything that caused anything else, but it's just a weird little detail that sticks in your head.
yeah, I mean, and that's also ignoring the rest of the rest of Jupe's character, who acts as an adult after suffering this just horrifically traumatic event. He is just not there. He is not he's gone. He's been gone for a while.
Yeah, it's so creepy when you realize, like, through up until this point, you've seen him kinda give this wear this sleepy little smile on his face a lot,
Mhm.
this kind of weird, distant little smile, and there's a moment in the movie where you realize that that smile is actually hiding the fact that he's dissociating and having a flashback to the worst possible memory that a person can have, and you're like, "Oh, fuck.
Well,
Oh, that's not good."
yeah, the shoe on its end is sort of emblematic of that, right? If you think back to it, it sort of feels like it's the weird detail, but also it's like a fucking cool shot, and it doesn't really mean
Yeah.
anything unless, not unless, but it even comes back because he has gathered the shoe as part of like his little shrine to he can only filter his his present moment
Through Chris
through
Kattan.
an SNL sketch, through like a filter of the shows that he was in. It's so weird. And I feel like if you get sort of if you aren't able to navigate what is literal and what is sort of metaphorical or figurative in the imagery, that is something that it'll just gum up your gears, I feel.
Without it, the character would just come across as a greedy idiot, I think,
Mhm.
and it
Yeah.
just would not have the same impact. If Jupe was just, "Ah, look at this greedy dipshit," it it wouldn't be as heart-rendering as it was.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I feel like, yeah, it gives him a lot of pathos. You sort of feel for him, but you also understand that he's not really a good force in this movie. By the end, you're like, oh yeah, in a way, he becomes the actual driver of what ends up being the plot.
Yeah, yeah, it's Nope is good. Go see Nope, if you
Yes,
haven't already.
please
It's
go
a
see
very
Nope.
good
It is
movie.
amazing.
And forgive us for talking about a movie when we should be talking about a book, but we're just using a contemporary example of that doesn't totally serve the plot. Maybe not directly in in this tidy little way, but like my god, the movie would not work the way it does without it.
Mhm.
So,
Well, I mean, to if we can talk a little bit about the how that is structured as well, because I mean, let's face it, we're talking about movies which are sort of an extension of drama that predate novels as well. So, I think that the thing here is that also part of the fun question mark of Nope is that a lot of the scenes don't exactly line up. I think one of the first scenes where he's taking Otis Sr. to the hospital, you see the X-ray, and then you see a baggie with a nickel in it. And imagine, if you will, just use this as as an exercise. Imagine, if you will, if someone in production or one of the executives had gotten a little bit nervous. He's like, "Well, you got to explain exactly what happened," and we would have had an entire scene where somebody hands OJ the baggie with the nickel in it and trying to
in
explain
the
exactly.
climax, he like flicks the nickel
Oh my
into the
god!
mouth of the monster or something and
And
kills
he'd
it.
have well,
Ugh.
he'd have to have a quip too, because he'd
Yeah,
flip it,
yeah, yeah.
and that would be the thing that would kill it, and then he'd have to have a nickel for your thoughts, motherfucker, or something like that.
God damn. No. Oh god.
Could
Oh,
you imagine?
fuck.
And then he'd walk away
Oh.
from the explosion
Yeah, in slow
without
motion,
looking
and he,
back.
like, wouldn't look behind himself because
Yes,
cool guys don't look at explosions.
yes. Um,
God damn.
you know, I hate that I figured out how to make this like an action flick.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
Anyway,
Step away from the lathe of heaven. Step away. Ugh. But let's, step away from Nope for a moment and talk about another way that excessive plot focus can damage your writing, and is that it flattens all narrative art into a plot delivery system, and that means you neglect craft.
mhm.
Like, we've seen a lot of very bad discourse, a lot of very questionable takes about how to be a writer, you don't really need to read in order to write
No,
fiction.
no, no, Raquel,
Gonna
don't
get
don't do it.
canceled. I mean,
And
you can just watch movies or play video games or watch Let's Plays because those also have narratives and plots. And that's all you need is plot. That's all you need is plot. Other media can give you story ideas. So that's all you need to write books. No, no. While other media can maybe give you story ideas, and that's true, you can absolutely take inspiration from video games. It's not going to show you how to craft an elegant sentence or how to write a really vivid description. These are features unique to prose, and in order to get good at them, you need to engage with prose, whether that's reading a book or listening to audiobooks. That's totally fine. That's a perfectly valid way to read a book. But these are features unique to prose, and video games don't have that because it's a different medium.
well, and so I sometimes go back and forth on this because yes, I do agree that you do need to read. You absolutely need to read. Let's be clear here. There is an old adage about what was it? Good artists borrow, great artists steal. And it's not that you should go plagiarize, but you go in and look and I'll tell you one instance where I wanted to write how a goat's eyes looked.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
because
I
they have
went
that weird rectangular pupil.
yeah, like a slotted eye, right? And I went back to, of all things, A Wizard of Earthsea because Ursula
Huh.
K. Le Guin has an interesting little scene where the main character, I forget what his name is at that point, but who will become Ged, the great archmage, basically swipes like a little charm that his aunt has used to bring the goats in to herd the goats, and they usually come when they're called and put themselves in the pen and all that good stuff. But he apparently is so powerful and doesn't know how to use the charm well enough that the goats just sort of like crowd him all the time. Like he's surrounded, he's chased around by a herd of goats, which is really sort of uncanny because she describes them like looking at him and eyeing him with those slotted eyes. Like it's a really vivid and almost like a horror moment because I mean, I don't know if you've ever looked at a goat or had a goat look at
They're a
you,
little
but it is
weird. They have
yeah, they're a
weird
little weird.
faces.
Yeah, yeah. And so I went there and I was like, "Oh, that's okay, so that's how she described it." And I used that description. You know, I just said, you know, he had slotted eyes, whatever. And that's a perfect example of why sometimes you do want to read. You need to read if you want to also, as you said, be able to model a good sentence structure or know how to sort of break up sentences for different reasons.
Yeah, yeah. You get
Be
these
it like
wonderful turns of phrase that you can borrow. Like, it's impossible to read Homer without deciding, I'm gonna use the phrase "wine dark sea" somewhere. I'm gonna
or
use it.
was it Dawn painted the sky with her rosy fingertips or something like that is another one that,
Right.
he uses a lot. These are all very, very vivid images, yes, great imagery. There's a reason that the translations have captured those those phrases throughout time because Homer is he's been dead and canceled in the ground for, you know, nigh on
Thousands of
4,000
years.
years. I might be off by a couple thousand, but it doesn't matter.
Right.
He's been dead for a long time.
Yeah.
I think that it also teaches you how to deviate from this three-act structure to insert moments of that are needless, right? Let's go back to Strunk and White. They're needless, but you know what? all of these words are needless. You don't need to write them.
Yeah. Your
You
book
want
is
to
not
write them.
necessary, probably,
Yes.
in the grand scheme of things.
Not even mine are needed. Like,
Yeah.
this isn't a dig against anyone specific. It's just simply that even my stories are not needed. I want to write them, and I feel like that's the thing, that there is this weird unbalanced aspect of it where you feel like you need to write these things, and therefore you need to follow these rules, because that's how you're gonna get your message out there, your capital M message out there.
Right. Your message. God.
I mean, what who was it that said, if we want to send a message, get Western Union? I forget who it
Yeah.
says that. It's like, yeah, it's not wrong. It's a little harsh, but yeah, not wrong.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, that's part of why you need to read too, is when you start looking at a book or a story as merely a plot delivery system, you're missing out so much of what is special about fiction. And I think this all ties to the way that we've started referring to art as content as
Mhm,
well. It's just this flattening of everything, this ignoring everything that makes every particular medium interesting or unique or special or powerful. And I dislike the idea of calling yourself a content creator when you're making art. Like content creator, I'd say a let's player is a content creator, and I'm
mhm.
not trying to be a bitch about that.
Yeah,
But
I feel like that's a fair dividing line, which isn't really a division. You're still doing something, like you're creating
yeah,
something, but it is derivative of something else. And yeah, like a let's play or a step-by-step game videos or what have you, of that nature. Hell, even like book talk and YouTube reviewers and stuff like that, I would also probably categorize as very close to, I would say that reviews actually are an art form in and of themselves, but it depends. I suppose that you'd have to check and see which reviewers feel like content and which ones don't, or are closer to the content versus art spectrum, if you will.
yeah, no kidding. And I probably sound snub. Cat, chill. Stop attacking my chair, buddy. Sorry, he's throwing a little tantrum. Maybe I sound naive, but I do believe in the concept of artistic integrity. I do think there's something that could be considered almost spiritual, for lack of a better word, about art, and the idea of art versus content. We use the word content because it's a very online word, and it's because companies like Facebook will create an online space for profit, and it needs users to fill in that space with stuff. And
Mhm,
that's why it's called content. It's an idea, it's an approach of your art as like the art isn't for you, it's for Mark Zuckerberg, it's for Jack, what's his face, the fucking Twitter guy, because you are filling in a hole in his platform, and you putting content there makes this work profitable. So it's not really for you, versus if you're making art, that's for you. Even if you never posted anywhere, even if you never shared somewhere, you've made this. You
mhm.
didn't make it to fill a hole for some like Silicon Valley dickhead. You made this because this is something you wanted to make.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably even say you've already said some of it there, but I would just say very simply, I think content is basically the corporatization, what a corporatization of art would sound like, right?
Yeah.
It is, in fact, as you were talking about, like fill in the space and blah blah. I was thinking about the slop.
Mhm.
Slop can fill in the space just as well as a fine, I don't know, T-bone steak or something. Something very nice. I don't know. I,
Right.
I haven't gone out in a long time, folks. I'm sorry. Maybe a
Right.
pate, but that's not. I'm going to get canceled for wanting cruelty to geese or whatever.
Yeah.
Even though that they can only see the world in violence. Um,
Yeah, geese are assholes.
yes,
There's an entire video game about it. It is a beautiful day in the village, and you are a
it is.
terrible goose.
It is an untitled game, is all I'll say. But yeah, it's weird because I don't want to get too much into mythologizing, like, oh, language can affect how you think, but over time, yeah, maybe if you are creating art and you start really considering it content, in and of itself what content means and what sells. Because I don't think it's the word itself. It's the word with the influence of profit and making money. Because let's face it, we all need to eat and
Yeah,
pay
yeah,
bills and keep a roof over our head. So no shade. I get it.
yeah.
But also, like if an artist just leans into the idea behind content, then they may end up making more content than than art,
Right,
which
right.
can be artistic, but it's just very doesn't take any risks. I mean,
Yeah.
we have 20 years of MCU movies for that, so
Yeah, and something I'm gonna point out too is that it's extremely rare for a content creator to actually make a living off of that, or for an artist to actually make a living off of it. So while I understand the impulse to try to sell out, if that's what you call it, probably no one's buying anyway. So I kinda
yeah.
take the approach of, like, no one's buying, and I know there's been discourse about, "Oh, it's privilege to sneer at selling out." Well, corporations are more likely to buy what you're selling if you're, like, a cishet white male anyway, so selling out is easier for people of privilege anyway. So, like, saying, "Oh, it's a privileged idea to sneer at selling out." Nah, selling out's easier if you're privileged in the first place, like Logan Paul or something, or PewDiePie. These are white, blonde
I mean,
dudes.
I would
It's
argue,
easier for them to sell out than it is gonna be for somebody who's, like, marginalized.
yeah. I would also not argue, but add being a Gen X type of guy myself, I feel like the only person that successfully sold out is Kevin Smith. So the rest of Gen X could go get fucked.
Yeah.
That was, and that's not me saying that. That's capitalism saying, "Well, fuck you," because the phrase "selling out" was like such a hilariously
Yeah, it was such a
like
Gen X thing. "I'll never sell out." And,
yeah,
like,
and
and I
it's
know in
very
the real world, we live under capitalism, and we've gotta negotiate with that. We're not gonna be perfect. Nobody's gonna be fucking perfect about that. But I
yeah.
do think there is a line somewhere.
Yeah. I think that there is. I think it can vary from person to person because honestly, like sometimes you don't want to give an inch, and that's a negotiation you got to make. As it is in flux and very, I would say, very much based on an individual creator's comfort with the concept of, I mean, whatever laughable concept there is behind
Yeah, and
selling out.
whatever you're making and your relationship to it, like, would you accuse Jim Davis of selling out? Well, it's Garfield, it's not this deep thing, who
Well,
cares?
he also set out to
Yeah, he
sell out.
blatantly
Like,
said, "I'm going to make as much money on this as possible," which
I mean,
fair enough.
the
He
fair,
succeeded.
yeah. I mean, the other end is the Chad Bill Watterson, where he's
Hell
like,
yeah.
yeah, I don't want any fucking merchandising. Also, you know what? I ran out of things to say. I'm going to go away now. Still in fucking syndication, still selling probably thousands of of his comic books a month, if not a week.
Yeah,
It's amazing.
absolute Chad.
Yeah,
Incredible. God, he could have made so much money if he was selling Little Hobbs plushies. He could
he,
have.
he
It's
could have, but yeah.
crazy to think of how much money he could have made, and he just very consciously knowing how much he could make off of it said, "Nah."
And if I'm not mistaken, like he had an advertising background, like he was doing graphic design for advertising
Oh,
and stuff like
wow.
that. So I do believe that he probably knew exactly what he was walking away from, but
Oh, yeah.
also, uh, after a while, that creation of his would have become like basically an albatross dragging him down. He couldn't have continued living life.
Yeah.
Good, good for him. He's out there learning how to oil paint or whatever.
Yeah.
Probably selling those little prints for 300 bucks a pop or more. Who knows? I don't
Who
know.
knows? Who knows? Just vibing. Good for him.
Which, yeah, like absolutely. The patron saint of vibes only out there.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess this is probably personal, and if somebody's like fucking poor as shit, I can't tell them what to do. My All I can say is here's what my own approach is, my own mindset is. In terms of me, I don't think I could sell out, not necessarily in terms of spirituality, but in terms of, like, I don't think anyone's gonna buy. So my approach is, why try to sell out when no one's gonna buy? So I'd rather make something that I find personally, personally very satisfying,
Mhm.
rather than most of us who are going to try to do the song and dance, "Please, please buy me, please Casper Mattresses sponsor our podcast, it's probably not gonna succeed anyway.
Yeah.
And to me, there's something really, really sad about aspiring to be a corporate spokesman and not even getting that.
Yeah. I mean, it's also to your point about selling out versus who's it's a buyer's market and no one's buying. That whole antitrust against the Penguin Random House merger,
There are
you know, that's
people
been
way more marketable than me, so
absolutely. I mean, but that also is sort of like see, the funny thing here is that as I saw a lot of people gnashing their teeth about like, oh, those spaces that they sold to whomever, you know, like Jamila Jamil or whatever, her memoir, that could have been given to somebody else more marginalized. And
Mhm.
you're like, they weren't going to do that.
Yeah, they
It
were never
doesn't
gonna do
matter.
that.
They're not gonna do that because they know that that's a celebrity memoir and that's gonna put X amount of dollars at the bottom line. They're not gonna risk it on you. And
Yeah,
there's perfectly valid and very legal ways for publishing to screw you specifically over that have nothing. People were gnashing their teeth about that and not understanding that, yeah, that just shows you that they don't know what they're doing. Yeah, absolutely. That everyone that has been following publishing for a while knows that people don't know how to sell books. It's just we
yeah,
don't know.
yeah, they really don't, it's kind of amazing.
It is. So I mean, you know,
Like, this
like
is
you
your
said,
job, this is you had one job.
but I think that
Literally, you had one job.
I think that that's also that's that it's a weird vice, right? Squeezing the market towards specifically one thing that they know does actually sell in certain circumstances, which is that plot driven 3x structure. They're rushing towards it even faster because even though it hasn't really sold as well as they expected, that's the one thing they know will sell. So let's double down on that.
Yeah,
It's very strange. It's very strange. It is a sort of almost counterintuitive thing that publishing does. And so to your point, yeah, like they don't know how to sell your book, so just write the book you want to write anyway. Fuck it.
yeah, yeah. So, let's switch gears and talk about what's a better approach to fiction, what's a better approach to plot? Well, vibes. No plot, only vibes. But by vibes, we mean focusing on atmosphere, focus on emotion. I guess here would be a good place to insert an idea I have floating in my head of the idea of fat books versus bloated books.
Mm,
People talk
mhm.
about trimming the fat of books. I don't think you should trim the fat out of books. I think you should remove the bloat from books. And there's a difference. Like a fat book is like a big, sprawling, broad book that maybe a book that watches a family across several generations and gives detailed genealogies of all the characters and like, hey, let's stop for a very detailed feasting scene and have some philosophical musings. Like to me, that's a fat book, and I love that shit.
That's
Versus a
y-
bloated book, which is
y-
like, let's jam in lots of really shitty banter.
or I mean, the I think that the parallel to that in a bloated book would be a book that has 50 characters and there's the main plot, but there's got to be like at least 6 or 7 other subplots in it.
Yeah.
You're like, does it though? Does it?
Yeah.
Because honestly, I am fine with following like the Buendia family in 100 Years of Solitude. That's a generational, sprawling generational book that spans obviously a century. The Michener books, those used to be everywhere for a while and they've gone away. You remember the ones where he'd start out in prehistory, Hawaii. You're like, he's writing about volcanoes right now at the beginning. That's weird.
Yeah, I love
It
that shit. I love,
I
like,
mean,
big fat books. Big fat
it
books rock.
I mean, it's great. It's great because it does give you like this weird God's eye view of this entire story, right? But it also the parody version of it is from adaptation, right? Where he's like, "Oh, we got to start at the beginning. Yeah, the dinosaurs," and you're like, "No, no, dude, a
Adaptation
little
is
closer."
perfect. That movie starring Nicolas Cage, Adaptation, it's about a screenwriter who's been tasked it's a Charlie Kaufman movie, was it?
Well,
I'm not sure.
I think it's a perfect movie
Yeah,
for this
for
podcast
this
because
podcast, because he's
one's a
been
vibe screenwriter and the other one's a plot screenwriter, and his brother is just so much better at writing screenplays.
and he has a great time and he makes tons of movies and everybody loves him. Girls like him. And the vibes-based screenwriter hates himself. Everybody hates him. And he's tasked with adapting this book, this nonfiction book called The Orchid Thief. And it's a very vibes book, and it's a nice, sprawling, fat book. And it's beautiful and lyrical based on the excerpts we give, but it doesn't make for a good Hollywood screenplay because you need something very strictly plot driven. So by the end of it, he's adapted this novel that's just about someone unsuccessfully hunting for the ghost orchid and turned it into this a thriller where our journalist is a sex crazed plant junkie willing to kill to get her next fix.
But that's after they visited a McKee masterclass, and he invites him for a drink, and it's so funny because that's the moment that you realize that the movie's going full meta.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, because remember he says, and God help you if you use voiceover. And by the
He's
end,
going, "Fuck, I'm using voiceover. God
I'm
damn it,
fucking
shit."
using. But I mean, it's great because it does offer like that synthesis at the end of how you can start off with a sort of vibesy type of approach to storytelling and still integrate very plot stuff, an action plot type of thing onto
It's
the
so
end.
good. It's
It's
such a
so
great
great.
movie. It's ridiculous. I loved it. But yeah, a different approach to writing, not so much plot, but vibes, character studies. There are a lot of novels that aren't exactly fast-paced, but instead it's an examination of somebody's inner character, and they're extremely compelling.
Yeah.
You can tell stories that are kind of episodic, where the events don't all add up to one single climax.
Oh, I have a
I love
great.
those. That's the good
Oh,
shit.
yeah, I mean, that's I believe the first instance of this is the picaresque, which is originally from Spain. I believe the first one of the first, like modern, what we would call a modern novel is a picaresque, which is the Lazarillo de Tormes and his fortunes or something to that effect. It's basically he is navigating Spanish culture, right? He starts off as a beggar. He helps a blind beggar, and he moves up, right? He then starts serving a priest. He's a squire, a friar, a pardoner, and a chaplain, and then an archpriest. I guess like a bishop or something. In any case, the point being that the picaresque offers a character study but no character growth. The
Hell
Lazarillo
yeah.
doesn't learn a goddamn thing other than each one of the people that he served was a different type of asshole towards him. That's pretty much it. Like the blind beggar starves him, hoards food for himself. In one instance, the Lazarillo stole like a little bit of bread. He found out where the blind guy had hid it, and he stole the bread because he's like fucking starving. He ate it, and he gets that blind guy beat the shit out of him,
My
knocked
God.
his head against the wall, and just stomped him a little bit.
Jesus.
It's really brutal, but I mean, like the Lazarillo is basically he's a beggar himself, so he's the lowest of the low in the societal ladder, and it just shows that he at the end of it, he is a little bit richer, but he's not by any means wealthy or anything like that. But basically, it's weird because it is offering like this weird world building by showing you how it was to serve under these different people and teaching you about the social strata of Spain at the time, which is the 16th century.
That sounds great.
It's also like really short. It's only got like like 7 chapters to it.
Really short. Yeah.
It's very short, yes.
That sounds
Um,
good.
See also Don Quixote. Does
Mm.
Don Quixote learn a goddamn thing in
No.
those 800 plus pages? Absolutely not. And often he's as often right about things in spirit as he is wrong.
Yeah. I do find that so interesting about Don Quixote because obviously Cervantes was dunking on the guy and making fun of romantic stories, but I've seen so many interpretations where Don Quixote, even though he's very clearly a crazy man, still is kind of the hero because,
Well, I
like, the
mean,
rational modern world is so shitty.
Well, I mean, think of the stereotypical, "Oh, he's tilting at windmills because he thinks they're giants." Well, let's think a moment about what's not said here about what the world was like. And this is specifically Don Quixote's happening in that shift, right? From sort of the feudalism of ancient, not ancient, but olden times, to the sort of like like the cities and the trades bourgeoisie taking over most of society, right? These are now the moneyed people. They're now in control. And what, just like the Luddites are misunderstood because, oh, they're against technologies. Like, no, they understood that labor would be affected by the loom. And just as that is the concept, Don Quixote is, even though he is delusional, he understands, identifies who the real culprit of this change is. It is nothing other than industry, which started with milling.
Yeah.
I mean, it's something that you need to sort of know a little bit about for it to be a little bit more than, I don't know. It's not that it doesn't change from vibes to something else. It's just simply that it's not trying to hold your hand.
Mhm.
And I feel like, to an earlier point you were making about the commodification of the artists themselves as part of the selling out process.
So, some other stories that we love that don't obsess over plot or don't obsess over this particular type of plot structure. If you try to describe the plot of Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata to someone, it sounds like the worst book ever, but it's fucking amazing because it has all these funny observations about society, about gender roles and modernity and sexuality and utilitarianism.
I mean, from what I've heard, I sadly have not picked it up yet, but
Oh,
from
it's
what
great.
I've heard, yeah, from what I've heard from you and other people that have read it, it is very funny in a, not, it's not trying to be a comedy, but just very funny, because I believe that the main character is just sees the world from, like, almost from a sideways angle. Yeah, it's just not really not really jiving with what the world is like, and she's finding her own path somehow, and it leads to a convenience store.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Maybe one of the classic and very little plot, mainly vibes, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf.
Mm,
There's very little that happens. A woman throws a garden party, and at one point, a man commits suicide, but it's really not connected to the garden party at all. And
it's
the
a
book is
bummer.
entirely about people's inner lives and about this woman, Mrs. Dalloway, looking over the course of her life. She's like 50 and she's looking back at the course of the life she's lived and thinking about, like, my choices led me here. Did I really make all the right decisions in some ways? And there's these people who've loved each other for decades, but for whatever reason didn't end up together. And it's regrets and it's a beautiful novel. It's just mapping the inner landscapes of this small community, and there's barely a plot.
Right.
Buys some flowers, she plans the garden party, and the garden party goes off really well, and that's it.
Well, Raquel, I'm going to express a little bit of skepticism, because we all know that these literary novels, all they're ever about is about a professor, a white professor, trying to nail his female students. I mean,
And they're
we all
very
know this.
cishet. Virginia Woolf, famously cisgender heterosexual Virginia Woolf. For real though, I was astonished reading the book about how upfront it was about queerness. Like,
Hmm.
Mrs. Dalloway is a lesbian.
Mhm.
And it doesn't use the word lesbian, but it basically says a certain virginity had always followed her. And like she and her husband, I think, have a kid, but there's not much of a relationship between them, very little in terms of sexuality. But she was very much in love with her friend Sally. And
Hmm.
it's very overt about the fact that she was in love with her friend Sally. and that's the real love of her life. And I was like astonished to read that. Maybe audiences of 19 was it what was it like 1918? It was the early 20th century when this was written, interpreted it a different way, but I read it and I'm like, holy shit, this character is a lesbian.
Right.
Like
Right.
really, really, really overtly.
Yeah, I mean, it is sort of really funny to run up against some of that stuff where you're not expecting it.
I was expecting metaphor and shit. I was not expecting it to be as open as it was.
Right. Another perfectly great vibes only book for at least I would say the first half, if not the first three quarters, is Moby Dick.
Hell yeah.
Speaking of, very overtly queer,
Oh
yeah,
yeah.
with Ishmael and
Incredibly
Prepreg,
gay book.
amazingly. Not to mention just full of the most sicko shit you can imagine sometimes, where it's like, what was it?
The dude
There's
falls
there
into the whale and has to be like cesarean sectioned out.
Jesus, the dudes that are like pounding the sperm, the fatty tissue out of the
S-
sperm whale.
Yeah,
Uh,
it is blatantly a circle jerk on the
the
deck of just
yeah,
squeezing this frothy white substance in a circle and gazing longingly at each other's hands.
the dude that basically made a cloak out of basically the whale's foreskin. It's just full of all sorts of sicko shit that is amazing. And then weirdly, I don't know what exactly happened, but Melville goes, "Oh yeah,
Oh yeah, there's that whale.
I should have an adventure story in the back half of this book." And the rest of it is honestly wall to wall action, basically, because they are chasing fucking Moby Dick across the Pacific. It becomes like a chase scene.
But it's 90% vibes up to that point.
Oh yeah.
90% gay vibes. It's really good.
What was the other one? I was just gonna. Not to get into old discourse again, but wouldn't you say Catcher in the Rye is very much a vibes?
A lot of vibes. There's not like this. It's a kid who wanders around, really.
Yeah, it's. I think it's both. I think it's mostly a character study and sort of like a somewhat turned on its head Bildungsroman coming of age story, but he's afraid of coming of age because
Because manhood
he's
means being a douche.
yeah, well, yeah, it's essentially every male figure in the book is basically just horrible.
It's just
You know,
predatorial.
yeah,
Like
just
90% of them are rapists of one variety or another.
sexual assault. All yeah, let's just do some light sexual assault because I'm your gym coach or whatever. He's like, no, how about not?
Yeah, like they're all terrible, and so it's like I don't want to be a man. Being a man is terrible. This blows.
Right, right. And the central sort of image and metaphor of the book is very vibes. It's almost like a dream sequence. This idea of that there's someone out in the rye that's going to catch you if you fall over the cliff into adulthood and in his case manhood.
Yeah,
Uh
yeah,
so yeah, anyway, yeah, I think that Holden Caulfield is vibes mostly for a long partly because it fits the sort of the structure and the character, right? He doesn't know what he's doing. He's wandering about, and therefore, I wonder if the fact that he doesn't really better himself, he doesn't really
no.
solve
He
anything.
has a
Uh,
full-on psychotic break from reality and ends up in a mental hospital, and he's talking to the doctors, but it's not like, "Hooray, therapy has been successful."
right.
Like he very clearly does not have much respect for the doctor he's talking to.
I do wonder, is that fact that it doesn't end with a triumphal
No.
note, what makes people really viscerally hate the book when in fact it's really sort of like it's almost tragedy. He's never going to fix anything. And
Yeah.
what lies ahead, he feels, is nothing but him breaking shit.
Yeah. Yeah. I think Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour, it's
Mhm.
one of those stories we're required to read in AP English Lit. It's very much internal. There's not exactly a plot. A woman finds out that her husband was killed in an accident, and over the course of an hour, she goes from grief to this feeling of liberation because at the time, a woman didn't have any kind of freedom until widowhood, and
Mhm.
then she finds out that her husband is actually alive, and she dies of heartbreak because she's like, "Fuck, I could have been free." And that's it. It's not this, like, plot-driven story, it's really philosophical, and it's this internal story about the status of women, the social status of women at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that.
And it's tragic too because her husband's not even, like, a bad guy. Her husband is not portrayed as abusive or cruel. It's just the way society is set up at the time is that if you are a married woman, you're your husband's property. You don't have independence, you don't have freedom, you can't open your own bank account, you can't own your own property. And, like, that sucks. Even if the guy you're stuck to is a decent guy, that still fucking sucks.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, because women owning their own bank account. I was shocked to find out that that wasn't actually something that you could do in the US until, what was it, 74 or something like
Yeah,
that?
like the '60s or '70s. Crazy recently.
It's really wild, and to a certain extent, I think a lot about these people, men that were in marriages before that came about. Like you're saying, I feel like they probably didn't want that to be a thing. They would have preferred if their wife. Maybe some of them didn't, but I'm going to guess a lot of them that had healthy relationships with their wives
Yeah.
wanted them to have a bank account, wanted them to have some
Yeah.
sort of
Or they knew
independence from them.
something was wrong but couldn't quite understand why,
Mhm. Right,
because
right.
maybe they hadn't heard because if you look at 1950s literature written by men, it's usually, "I can't stand my wife and children. I feel suffocated." And there's not an understanding as to why. Like, maybe if women had more legal status, I wouldn't feel suffocated. But I think intuitively they knew something about this sucks.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, a lot of them channeled that toward like, "Ah, my wife's a bitch." Like, "Oh,
Yeah, I
man."
mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, because let's face it, this is a culture that loves to pin pin the blame for a systemic issue on an individual. That's how it
Right.
sort of, yeah. And so when I get home, Jesus, my wife will not stop jabbering at me. I haven't thought to myself walking in the door that my wife has been alone for probably 8 plus hours of her day, maybe only talking
To an
either
infant.
to an infant who is not capable of real speech, not on a peer-to-peer level at least, or just watching the most mind-rotting daytime television. And so she's coming to yammer at me, Jesus Christ, can I get a moment alone? Which is, you can understand it. It's not nice. I'm
Yeah,
not
you
going to
wanna
say it is.
decompress after work, probably, but
Yeah, but you can understand where it's coming from, but then you start the problem starts becoming that becomes who you pin the blame on, not these unseen, inchoate problems that exist in the system.
right, right. It becomes like, "Ugh, my wife sucks," and not like, "Hey, maybe the nuclear family was a really bad idea. This is not working. We're both fucking
Right, like
miserable."
I mean, I think that's one of the really fascinating aspects of Mad Men that shows you like Don Draper's not a good person,
No.
but because it's almost expected of him. He has some house out in the fucking boonies, some suburbs in Connecticut, because that's what
That's what
everyone
you
who
do.
yeah, that's what you do if you work on Saks and Fifth Avenue or whatever, right? If you're part of that highfalutin executive crew. And there's that scene where Betty just turns on him, and it shows to a certain extent how unprepared Betty is, and perhaps to a certain extent has been stunted in her development, where she's
Right.
like she thinks that the children are against her, like it's a mutiny, and you're like, no, they're children, they cannot really do much of anything to you. But
Yeah.
she feels accosted by them whenever she's alone for extended periods of time and Don's not there, because Don is off screwing whoever he feels like. He's not a
Right.
again, folks, he's not a good
He's
person.
not a great guy.
But also, Mad Men, not to invoke the dreaded TV show or movie again, but Mad Men is a perfect example of a very vibes oriented type of show where you're invited to do this character study for, what is it, 7 7.5 seasons or something
And
like
he
that.
and in the end, he doesn't learn anything.
God damn, he
He
doesn't.
learns nothing. He's the
Why
same fucking person.
why would he? All that bullshit that he's done has proved successful. Why should he learn from that?
Yeah, it's great. It's so good. Ugh.
I love it.
So let's see. You suggested Axolotl by Julio
Yeah.
Cortázar as another very vibes-based story, and that's a story that we covered in a previous book club edition.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's very internal. It happens in one place at the I forget the correct name of it, but it's like one of
At
the
the zoo.
yeah, it's at the zoo in Paris. And basically he's looking at an axolotl through the glass. It's a story about him internalizing how he's an alien, like he feels alienated and weird and not part of, like he feels like he's under glass
Yeah.
in Paris, and how the axolotl is a kindred spirit, and eventually becomes a story about sort of like transformation or transmutation even.
Yeah.
It's very strange, and it's very short too.
Oh, yeah, it's a quick one.
Yeah, but it packs so much into that short space. It's so good.
Yeah. Do we wanna do one more example, or do we wanna wrap it up? Just because 'cause I'm
Oh,
anxious
we
that
could.
Zencaster might fart out on me again.
You mean
This
the
is
one time we're recording, Raquel?
the one
Uh,
time we're recording in one single recording session because
yeah.
Zencaster's working extremely well today.
I mean, I think you had mentioned Ted. Aha! I think you'd mentioned Ted Chiang, and I would. I think you had noted the Tower of
Tower
Babylon,
of Babylon, yeah, it has
but
this unusual plot structure that falls more into the way that Babylonian stories were told and
mhm.
not so much the way that modern three-act structure works, and it
I mean,
is
I would
extraordinary.
I would probably say that a lot of his work in general is very
Very
vibesy.
vibes-based.
Yes.
It's very
Like even a story, the complete story of you, or whatever became Arrival. The
yeah,
story
story of
itself
your
is very
life,
good.
I
The
think.
story of your life, yes. That, and jeez, I'm trying to remember the Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate is also a great
I
one.
don't think I know that one.
It's that one's really cool. It's sort of like Ted Chiang's riff on Scheherazade or something to that effect, but shorter, much shorter.
Nice.
But anyway, yeah, like I think that there's a lot of that type of writing out there. It's just you have to sort of look for it because it's not the stuff that I feel like a lot of people talk about. At least in my in my corner of genre, I don't feel like the stuff that gets buzz is a lot of that vibes based stuff. It's stuff
Yeah.
that it needs to happen. You gotta have action or
I
whatever.
think
It's
people
like,
buzz it, but they don't understand why. They'll buzz it and they'll fall in love with it, and then they'll scold you if you write that way. Like, you're not supposed to do it. Like, "Oh, okay. Okay, fuck you."
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's that old saying about that's attributed to Picasso. I don't know if it's true or not, but him saying that he had to, was it learn how to paint like Raphael for X amount of years before he could figure out how to paint like a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
Um, which is funny because he's just dunking on his own cubism or whatever, but it is funny because he's not wrong. He's pointing out that you need to know sort of back to front what the rules are, so that you can sort of mess with them, perhaps
Yeah.
break them on occasion, bend them at the very least often.
Right. Right. So in conclusion, don't worry about plot as much. Vibe, vibe, write a big fat story.
Yeah, give us quiet character moments. Give us people staring out windows and thinking
Yeah.
about what the fuck is what the fuck is going on and stuff like that.
Yeah,
I don't
give us
know.
lovingly detailed descriptions of food.
Hell yeah.
Fucking do it. I
And not just they ate food. I think you'd made this point before, Raquel. Give us specific foods.
It tells us something too, and there's just this wonderful sensory experience in it. Like
Mhm.
when I was reading We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and reading that book made me want a soft boiled egg with a piece of toast more than anything else in the
Mm.
world, because over and over and over again she talks about, I think Mary Cat ate a soft boiled egg with a piece of toast. And it sounded like the most wonderful thing in the world, and reading it, I'm like, "I have to go make a soft boiled egg right fucking now. I've got to make a soft boiled egg for
Yeah,
myself. It sounds amazing."
Yeah, yeah, it sort of turns on that, oh, yeah, the unctuousness of like a weird sort of dippy, yolk of an egg on toast. Yeah. You know what? I'm making myself hungry. I'm gonna go make myself
Yeah,
something all day
I
with
had to
toast.
go out and make eggs on toast. I had to go make myself some runny eggs on toast
Hell yeah.
while reading that book.
Well, folks, now we're gonna finish this one out making you hungry, so
Sorry. Go
sorry.
eat some eggs. Sorry, vegans. But before we go, where can our listeners find and support your work?
So I run a podcast called Podeside Picnic, where we discuss science fiction, fantasy, and the literature of the fantastic. I have three co-hosts, Pete, Kurt, and Chris. We love to discuss fiction, novels, movies, whatever strikes our fancy, really. We recently finished like an Augusta Geddon episode month, I should say, where we just did a bunch of reviews and talked about movies and media that dealt with post-apocalyptic stuff. We probably will be doing a Dino-vember.
Hell
So
yeah.
so if you're interested in talking about dinosaurs of different stripes, we will probably be covering a little bit about that in November. Mark your calendars and get your
Hell yeah.
Patreon clicks ready.
Excited.
Also, I have my own personal website, alignofink.com. I generally have some of my bibliography and previous fiction written there, and you'll find my fiction there as well. So Jesus, I forgot about this almost. I am also now recently the nonfiction editor over at Seize the Press
Hell
magazine.
yeah.
So if you have some sort of pitch that is anti-capitalist, that deals with dark, dark fantasy, cyberpunk, horror, you name it, as long as it's genre and it's anti-capitalist, send me a pitch. I'd be interested. This includes even book reviews. So if you have a book review, something recent that you read that you thought fits the bill, talk to me about it. It's Karlo at seizethepress.com.
Great. Well, thanks for coming on and thanks for talking to me and thanks for enduring Zencaster's quirks today.
Well, you know,
Or
Zencaster,
possibly my internet connection. It might be
yeah,
because I have Spectrum and it's
I mean,
terrible.
yeah, I mean, Zencaster was duly named for today because you needed to practice a lot of Zen to
Yeah.
get through it. So,
It may well
uh,
just be Spectrum because Spectrum is really, really fucking bad.
sorry about your internet connection, though.
It's raining, so the internet doesn't work very well. It's a very, very good
Oh,
company that I've got
s-
here.
so they're running it through an F-35.
Apparently so.
It and the F-35 don't work in rain. Okay.
All
Uh,
right.
well, thanks for having me on, Raquel, and thanks everyone. Catch you next time.
Yeah. Thank you all for listening. If you like what you heard, head to patreon.com/writegood and subscribe. Until next time, keep writing good.
This has been Rite Good with Raquel S. Benedict. Hosted by Raquel S. Benedict and produced by Matt Keeley for KS Media LLC. Theme song by OK Glass. For comments and concerns, please write to us at writegood@kittystasis.com. That is RITEGUD @kittystasis.com. If you'd like to support us, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/writegood. This has been a Kitty Sneezes production.
kittysneezes.com in color.